Okay, we are now recording. Everyone, welcome to another edition of the Dendron Greenhouse Fall Edition. So today I'm really excited for Ryan's talk. I've been bugging him for a long time to give it, and so I think he's finally given up and relinquished to it. And a little intro for Ryan. Ryan's intro. He has worked 6 years of working with data and leading data teams. Until recently, he led data engineers in a company with systems that are over 30 years old, but were still critical to day-to-day work. Ryan's team was the fixers, who would always find a way to get things done. Just maybe it wouldn't be 100% stable. The last project he embarked on was documenting their databases with over 10,000 tables of data. And that's exactly what he's going to be talking to us about today. So without further ado, Ryan, handing it off to you.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm given that there's 10,000 tables when all you need is a note. This says basically everything Kevin just said. My team, as you kind of mentioned, were the fixers, right? My expertise and my brand was getting things done, which is quite important for some of the context of this talk. So there's the old sort of triangle or thing, which is you can have something cheap, fast, or that works. Pick two. Me and my team often were asked to do the cheap and the fast bucket, but also still make it work as much as possible. So they did try and ask for all three, but that's kind of where we excelled, and that's some of the context of where this solution actually came from. And to add more context to that, that's kind of what I'm going to start with. And I'm going to take you through the tool we picked. You might be able to guess which one it is. I'll take you through kind of how we went about it, and then kind of some of the next steps that we're planning to do as well. So to give some kind of context, we had two massive Oracle databases. There are plenty of other databases and tools and systems, but for our kind of analytics, our BI, all the machine learning stuff we built off, all of that data we would use for reporting sat in these two massive Oracle databases. We had over hundreds of schemas. Of course, they were named probably sensibly at the time, but when someone named them 6 years ago and then left the company, you've no idea where anything is or what anything stands for. And over 10,000 tables. Probably we're looking closer to about 50,000. I don't remember kind of the exact number. A lot of them were junk or useless, but even just kind of looking at some of the core stuff, well over 10,000, so far beyond kind of just we can work through this in like a week or something like that. I got bored and did a search on IKEA for just the word table, and they only have just under 1,000 different varieties, so that hopefully gives you an idea of scale there. We had all of this, and all of this stuff, like I said, was used for hundreds of, well, actually probably closing into 1,000 different reports, BI dashboards, insight requests, even some sort of loose finance reporting as well. And of course it had about zero documentation. I think I could count on one hand the number of tables I knew that had columns commented within the database, and I could probably count on both hands how many sort of PowerPoint decks we had floating around on someone's laptop that would explain some of the columns and how they came to be and what they meant. There was one table we used that was probably our like core reporting table we would use for, I don't know, probably 50% of the stuff. We had a numerical column in there, which was some calculation, and we had 7 different versions in that table. And after 6 years, I still couldn't quite tell you the difference between all those different versions. You just tend to use the one with a higher number. And I want to be clear, right? Like, this is not anyone's fault. I always blame the second law of thermodynamics for most of my problems in life. I'm oversimplifying it, but the idea is entropy only ever increases. So you kind of basically don't put energy into something, it's going to get messier, which is why my house is always a mess, is because I've not put the energy into it, right? And over time, that just didn't happen overnight. We're kind of talking about years and years of hundreds of different people building solutions and data sets and scripts and reports. And then instead of having the time to document and kind of focus on stuff, they then get told to build a different report or build something new. So it's not anyone's fault that we didn't have that documentation. There was always something more seemingly important to do, but we got to the point where it became a real issue. To give the context of where me and my team were, we were down in this bottom right bit here, this data engineering team. We'd work into the data office. They'd work into kind of our operational director within the business. They would then work into the CEO, and we also have a CTIO, so Chief Technology and Information Office, that we would work with, but normally when they needed something for us, not so much the other way around. And then one level above that, we actually had a parent company who had their own technology unit, who were more in charge of a lot of the kind of big technology decisions in terms of kind of which kind of software to bring in and kind of the core stuff like that. But despite being that, we were responsible for the data and insight for all of that operational area, which covered about 20,000 people. Plus, we would do some insight and reporting for other areas as well. So we're quite important, and what we did was used by a lot of people, but also we didn't actually have much influence or power in any of the decisions that were being made, which made it quite difficult to be able to kind of prioritize and work on the documentation stuff. So all of that, as if that wasn't bad and difficult enough, right? We were getting by, things were going fine, we were able to do it. Given mentioned, so we had some systems that were 30 years old. We had some people that had been in the company 30 plus years as well. But we had an additional problem, which is our knowledge actually was going down over time. We had people who'd been there 20 plus years who kind of, if they couldn't answer your question immediately because they just knew it, they'd know where to go to find it. They understood all the data. They were there when it was created. Some of them did create it. And they'd kind of be able to just sort of know things that you build up when you spend plenty of time in a company. So we had quite a few people of them leaving through either retirement or going to other jobs. And we had quite a lot of new starters where the kind of the balance of the team ended up quite heavy on kind of junior data engineers or new starters compared to the ones with kind of the expertise and the knowledge. Some of them had experience doing data engineering, but not in our sort of domain, definitely not with our data. Some of them didn't really have that much experience at all. So it was kind of a wide range of people who didn't really know, which, fair enough. They've just joined. Why would we expect them to? But we also didn't have many people who could spend a load of time kind of helping them on a lot of stuff. So we had all those problems, right? We kind of weren't important enough as a team to ask for a load of things, yet we got asked for a load of things. We were losing kind of knowledge over time, and we had all of this, just tons of data that was completely undocumented. So how did we go about fixing this? Well, the first thing I did was I basically set out some criteria for whatever solution we came up with needed to satisfy, and kind of put this out to some of the people who had been around a long time in the business, some of the newer people, and said, right, what could work, what would satisfy this thing, and then evaluated all of them against it. So it needed to be easy to get information out of. People had tried sort of similar things before, right, where it was like an Excel sheet there, or kind of sort of a Confluence page here, right? But the problem was a lot of them were not easy to get vast amounts of information out of because it's very messy. It was kind of inconsistent, or you'd forget where it was, or it would be out of date, all that kind of stuff. It needed to be easy for many people to contribute to, right? As I mentioned at the start, it was way too much for just me and my small team to do. And also we didn't have all of the knowledge. There were people, again, those 20 plus year people who'd been there that weren't in my team, but knew a lot of the information. And so we wanted to get everyone to be able to contribute to varying skill levels within that. We wanted it to be version controlled with approvals, was just quite an important part. I mentioned those Excel sheets and stuff, ends up an absolute mess because there's no kind of gating process. It had to support structures and templates so that we could kind of enforce that consistency. Had to allow us to validate those inputs, ideally automatically. Sure, we could read and check that it satisfies the template, but we'd want to be able to validate those. It had to be free and allowed by our software policy. Remember that graph of how far away we were from the technology unit? Getting software approved and or getting budget for it wasn't really in scope for this project, so had to be something we kind of already had or we were able to get quite easily. And not really a requirement, but something we kind of kept in mind was that it didn't need to be a perfect solution. The company was long-term looking at cloud migration, investing in metadata management software, all of the stuff that would then kind of help automate a lot of those pieces. This was really to help for the next year, 2 years while they were going through that journey to help capture the knowledge of the experts and some, like I say, who were leaving, and help disseminate that out to everyone else. And so we kind of put everything in there, and we, like I say, we sort of had Confluence as an idea, Excel, Dendron, all that kind of stuff. And we ended up going with Dendron. This is not a direct quote from Kevin, but it's kind of roughly what he says every time. He's just use Dendron. It solves your life problems, cheaper than therapy. And for us, it did solve the problems, right? I can list the things off. It's easy to get information out of. It's structured. It's easy to search. It's one of the core things that I think Dendron can like build itself on, is just get information in, get it out as well. It was easy for many people to contribute to, right? Just a Git repo and the end of it. Version controlled, again, approvals, all the kind of Git stuff made that suitable. It supports structures and templates through the templates and schema stuff. We did have to branch out to Python to allow us to validate those inputs because Dendron doesn't enforce that structure, which was fine. And it was built on top of VS Code, so it was already basically approved, which was fantastic. So we had our tool. We went, great, we know what we're going to use. Here's how we actually went about building it. 6 varyingly difficult steps. There's an asterisk there for a reason, but we'll take you through kind of the steps we went through to actually build this solution and then what we got out of it. So I want to start this with a big caveat up front. The things I'm going to recommend and the way we went about it were very specific to the solution we were trying to build. It actually goes against the advice I give people when they're using Dendron, and I will try and call out when I'm specifically going against what I think is normal Dendron use and the way we were using it. But just if there's a bit that I come across and you're like, that feels like not how it was meant to be used, or not kind of the way you're using it, just bear in mind it was for quite a specific and locked down approach. So this is kind of the roadmap we took. We started with a design workshop with just the people who were going to be building the solution, not contributing information to it, not consuming from it, just the people who were involved in actually building the thing. Then we develop our schemas and templates. We deal with auto-generating some notes, build some automated testing, develop and trial some hackathons, and then actually run them. To be fair, steps 2 through 6 we decided as part of step 1. Didn't have this nice plan up front. We were like, let's just get in a room and sort some stuff out. But this is the journey we kind of took to get there. So the design workshop basically had 2 goals. We wanted to agree the full hierarchy, so the kind of structure we were going to be taking with all of the notes in the solution, and also agree the sections down to like the lowest header level of our templates for each of those things. This is the thing that I think is most, don't do this in Dendron normally, right? The whole point of Dendron is you can refactor, right? I always say to people, don't worry about getting templates set up for meetings perfectly, right? Just start something, you'll find out there's a header you're constantly adding or not using, add, remove it, whatever, right? Your notes from 2 years ago don't need to match your notes today, right? That's part of the beauty of it. It's super easy to refactor and rename. We didn't want that, partly because we were going to have so many people contributing. We wanted some stability to it. We wanted to keep stability on the front ends, on the published site, so people knew where they were going. And we just kind of, also because we were going to auto-generate these notes and validate the structures so much, we kind of needed those templates quite locked down from the beginning. One thing we actually started the workshop on and then changed halfway through was we started thinking of it in almost like a physical structure. So we have our database, which has some name, that has some schema, and within that schema you then have some tables and some procedures and some functions and some views. And so we started with that structure, right? We're going to have database name, dot, schema name, dot, and then we were like, well, is it then just the name of the table, which doesn't help you visually see, was this a table or is this a procedure? Or we would then have like dot table and then the table name, or dot schema or dot function and the function name. And it didn't quite feel right that you would kind of get halfway through before you even really knew what you were looking at. So we decided to pull that asset type up to the very front. So our hierarchies were based on the assets they were relating to. So tables was one hierarchy, and then under that it would be table dot database name dot schema name dot and then the name of the table. we would then have one for procedures or functions, and they would have the same kind of middle hierarchy, but it meant when people were going to look for something, they already knew what hierarchy it was in, they knew where it was, and also at that point it's kind of a procedure in a database is very different from a table, right? So the structure and the way you would use that note and the way it was structured would be completely different. This actually helped us for something I'm going to talk about later, which was kind of extending this, because we weren't already kind of locked into something being partway down. We could kind of add new assets at the very top. So we then went off and kind of fully designed our template. So this is an example of, I think, about 1/3 of a template at this point, and I think this is for tables. So at the top we have this massive comment block that basically just explains our templating, because we'd be dealing with people who hadn't really touched Markdown before. So the idea is, look, when you're presented with something in triangular brackets, put some text there, right? What actually is it? If you've got a list, here's how lists work. Here's how notes work. We had some note references in there as well. This is what tables look like. Right? We'll have provided the headers. Don't touch them. Put everything in there. And then also you could kind of comment and uncomment some stuff. So we had some like Shield IO badges that would tell us about like the note status or how valid we think the data is. Like I say, we'd have some notes in theory just to the parents, right? So what database is it in and what schema is it in? So we could use all the backlink stuff that says, oh, this is linked in here. We have owner information that could either be based on the system owner or the user tags. And then for certain stuff, so we had like table source, for example, could be a link to a procedure, or it could be a link to a SharePoint or a GCS bucket or stuff like that. So we'd really locked this down throughout that workshop. We went, right, what is a table? What do you need to know about it? What sections do you have? So you had like basic information, table structure, and then we also always had this kind of fourth section, which was general information, which would have things like how to get access, free, and just free text sections so people could put stuff in there. But again, this is not, for most stuff, not what I would recommend doing. For us, it was perfect though, because we needed that really consistent structure, capture all this information. And again, I'll talk about why this was quite helpful and important to us when I come to something a bit later. So we had our templates, we had our hierarchy structure set. We had, like I said, I think 5 or 6 hierarchies that we'd done this for. Next, it came on to actually generating the notes. So we didn't want to write most of these out manually. As much as I said there's 0 documentation, it's kind of technically a lie, right? There is metadata already in the database. All of the column names, all of the column types, what a table is partitioned by. I would say primary and foreign keys, but we didn't enforce them. Indexes, all that kind of stuff exists in the database, right? So there was no point asking someone, hey, can you go and document this 150 column table and type up all of the columns manually, right? So he scraped all of those in. Like I say, it was scraped to a CSV. Used Python basically to loop through and generate the Markdown documents, putting the correct text from those files in the right places. And then use the Markdown import pod to actually import them into Dendron. The Markdown import pod starts to break down a little after about 2,000 notes, is what we discovered. We also discovered that you didn't need to do that at all. You could actually just generate the front matter yourself, and then Dendron would pick it up, which we don't know why we didn't do from the start. It made everything much easier. And so that's what we ended up doing as we kind of kept going through. And the one other thing we did as well, which worked quite well for us, was every schema in the database basically with its own Git branch. So it probably made it slightly more difficult in basically in the actual generation to try and get it to do all of the Git work in the background at the same time. But it was really important for us because it meant you could see which schemas we had already kind of auto-generated. And if you were looking for a particular table, you knew it was in that schema branch. You didn't have to try and pull it out of this massive branch that would have had God knows how many changes on it. And there was only one time we accidentally pushed one of those branches to main by accident, so it's fine. I technically lied. I didn't lie at the start. We did start with trying to document 10,000 plus tables, but when we got to it, really we didn't need that many, right? I mentioned that there was a table that was used in probably 50% of our analysis. Most of the tables we used were kind of in a couple of schemas, and even in there only kind of a couple of tables. So for anyone who hasn't come across like the Pareto principle before, it's basically 20% of your effort gets you 80% of your results. So for us, 20% of our tables are used in probably 99% of our analysis, right? These databases have been around for years. One of them started as a sandbox environment. Most of the stuff was junk. So we knew kind of the important schemas to work from. I think we settled on about 40 schemas in total that we did, and we still had, I think, about 8,000 tables or something. So we still did a lot, but we just didn't bother with a load of the junk ones. But we also knew we could always just rerun that script really quickly on the CSV file to produce the new one. It would get added as a new branch if someone did need a different schema. So we had 8,000 or something notes across all of these different Git branches now, which was fantastic. The problem was we could ask people to fill it in, they could put in a merge request, but then every time they did, we would have to manually review it, check it against the template and see if it's right. So I mentioned this needs to be a link in here, this needs to be a table, this should be a note ref, all that stuff. So we needed to build in some automated testing. So the test itself, I contributed to, but someone else in my team wrote kind of the core of, so don't ask too many technical questions of me on this one. But the first step was basically to load and pass the markdown using Beautiful Soup, which is normally meant for parsing HTML. So already we're off to a wonky start where it's not quite what it's meant for, but it works pretty well. We then kind of reduced PyTest basically to compare the expected values to what was actually in each part. So Beautiful Soup would split it up based on the headers, and then we would kind of compare, well, this header should have this type of content and so on. Sounds easy. It pretty much was using every possible edge case of PyTest you could come up against. The documentation technically exists for each individual component we used, but not all together. We're kind of hacking bits from various Stack Overflow posts and stuff. So anyone who's used PyTest might recognize some of these terms, but we were using kind of dynamic parameterized tests, because parameterized tests, you can run one test with 5 different inputs, great, but we needed to change our input based on the content of the note. We were using fixtures and marks to make sure that if it was a table type note, we would run this set of tests. If it was a procedure type note, we would run this set of tests. So we only wanted to run certain tests based on that, which meant we had to use in the actual CI/CD itself, we had to work out which notes which notes had even changed, because we didn't want to run it across every single note, and then what type of note it was, which we actually got kind of lucky because we could just use the first word or first 2 parts of the hierarchy because we'd pulled that asset information up front. If we'd kept it buried halfway down, we actually would have been annoyingly difficultly stuck at this point because we didn't know where in the hierarchy the table name necessarily always would have fallen. So we got quite lucky. We could basically take the first part of the hierarchy that would tell us what type of note it was and then which type of test to run. But we got it working. It was touch and go for a while, but we managed to kind of cobble everything together. And then we would just run it on CI/CD. So every time we had a merge request go through GitLab, it would automatically run this for us. It would then identify which notes had changed, run this, pass them, run the specific test to compare, is this content of a note link type? Is this a table content? Is this a list? That kind of stuff. Does it contain only these types of characters? Kind of basic stuff to start with, which meant we only had to really kind of review a few other bits in there instead of having to check every single thing. Have they included things that are mandatory, all those kind of bits. Even things like header names and header ordering we checked, because sometimes people just delete things for no reason. So great, we had an hour away to test it. We had all our notes. What was next? Well, next was the hackathons. So I haven't put a slide in here for kind of developing and testing them, but we basically trialed a mini hackathon with a couple of people first, make sure the day structure worked, make sure they could install all of the software and get everything right. We've been using it now for, well, everyone had been using it for at least weeks, but you've got VS Code, you've got Git, you've got Dendron, right? Some people have not got any of those installed on their laptop, so making sure that works for everyone. All those instructions are really clear. And all that stuff is fantastic. They've got access, all the accesses they need, that kind of stuff. All of that we documented in the solution that we were going to use. It was all in one place, and it meant, hey, if you want to contribute to this in the future, here's all the information. Found a few issues with that, just went away, worked it through, and then had the hackathon. So we were a kind of national company. There was a couple of hubs, but people were scattered all over. So we physically co-located the events, get everyone in a room together, provided a free lunch as a nice sort of bonus for them to show up. And we did a full day event. So it was basically like, clear your diaries, this is what you're focusing on today. The first part was to teach the basics of Dendron, VS Code, and Git, because a lot of people, you didn't know most of them, let alone all of them. We then had people make their first contribution, pick a table they knew and were confident with, and then do their first, raise their first merge request, and then basically continue contributing. And we had kind of a competition that was going to run for, I think it ended up being about 3 weeks after each hackathon. And there was a competition per kind of group who could contribute the most information, which we kind of lazily was like, it's probably just the most number of lines that'll roughly cover it, because we wanted to adjust for the fact that a 4-column table much easier to document than like a 500 column table. There is all the boring business stuff, which tech people tend not to care about, but anyone who's like a project manager is like, yes, finally, all the boring business stuff. So we kind of needed all of this as well. So from execs, we needed their buy-in. Why should they support this? Why should they fund this, both from their people's time, but also money for the lunches? We had data quality people who kind of were really asking us quite aggressively, why can't we just wait for the proper solution, right? And this goes back to that point where I mentioned about that structure and why that was really helpful for us. Because it's just a markdown document, but because we forced that structure on, it meant not only could we scrape the database, create a CSV, and then put that information into the notes, we could do that in the reverse as well, right? We could scrape the notes that people have contributed to, and then we could have that information in a file that could be uploaded and exported to a tool that would be able to consume it. So while they were going, why can't you wait? And we went, because we don't have 10 years. We were saying, but all of the information that's going in this, you'll be able to consume in the future as well. So it's helping them in the future. For the actual people who are contributing, right, why should they want to? Well, it was quite easy for a lot of them, because we were like, hey, you spend all of your time answering questions from people. What if you didn't have to? What do they get out of it? That kind of stuff, other than just a free lunch. The people managers, right, why should they actually let their people go? Right? They've got other stuff they should be working on. Why should they get involved with this? And why should their people do more after the day, right? Why should they keep contributing going forward? And then what about call them the knowledgeless people, but people who maybe don't work in our databases and don't know our data, right? How can they still add value, and how could we reduce the number of those that there were in the first place? Because we went with that asset approach where that was the start of the hierarchy, we were actually, as we went through, able to add a couple more assets or asset types that we hadn't originally planned to. So we added things like measures, where there's a couple of people who sort of really strongly define our measure scope, but maybe don't write the SQL and actually do it themselves. There was a lot of BI people who worked in a reporting tool called Click. So they would build reports and dashboards, but they maybe didn't know our raw data very well. Working with them, we were able to come up with a template basically for a report asset type and a measure asset type and some other stuff they worked with as well, which meant they still were able to use the Dendron and learn it, use Dendron and learn it. They would come and contribute. Even if not our original idea, they basically saw the benefit of this. I'm like, that's fantastic. Can we get it for our stuff as well? And because we kind of had stuck to that asset at the top structure, it became really easy to add that stuff to reduce the number of knowledgeous people, because it was basically like, well, what do you know? Great, we'll add that in as well. That's what we did. Did it work? Yes, right? In general, yes. We had 5 hackathons. Genuinely, by the end of it, I was sick of sandwiches. Okay, took me like a month of, like, if anyone just gave me like a triangle piece of bread, I would cry. We had 43 merge requests by the end of it. So the team across the data office was probably about 110 people. So we didn't quite get everyone involved, but given a lot of them were kind of, sort of project managers and stuff, and a lot of them were new, that's a really kind of high hit rate for us. After the first one, most of our tests worked correctly. The first one was a great learning experience, but we got it all working. And that allowed us to basically immediately, it would show up and say, hey, you need there's no value in here, but it's mandatory. Or, hey, this should be a link, but you've just put it as plain text, something like that. And then we would just comment, tell them, and then they would go away and fix it. So we didn't have to check all of that. I don't know the total number. I think it's about 120-ish. Kind of just from those merge requests, but we had over 100 tables documented, which if I go back to the start where I was like, there's not actually that many tables we use day to day, right? You can get away with just the core of them. This was really fantastic for us. Mostly it worked, is what I will say. So the boring business stuff was the bits that we kind of slipped up on, and I've actually tried to do something similar to this in the past, and it went way worse for the record. I didn't have Dendron, and I'm just going to blame it on that because it makes life easier. But the two bits that kind of were an ongoing issue were basically very well linked. So I'll start with the bottom one. So the people managers, after the hackathons, we had one person who kind of kept contributing, despite offering them money to win if they kind of won the competition. And the reason for that was because we didn't really have that full exec buy-in. And it's the bit I mentioned at the beginning about kind of the second law of thermodynamics, right? Where there was always something more pressing for those people to be working on, right? So my team, I basically said, half a day a week, I want you doing this, right? It was nice and easy. For other people, there's always another dashboard to be building. There's always, other insight to generate, other machine learning models to build. There's always something that was more pressing and more demanded and asked after. Because that pressure was coming from their managers and so on. So we hadn't quite got the buy-in at a high enough level to say, you need to tell your managers to tell their people to contribute to this. And that was kind of one of the issues. So it was still really successful to get a big core chunk done, but it maybe didn't see the kind of continual growth we expected. But as I was kind of leaving that team, it was one of the things they were basically going to sort of reignite and work with is, well, those managers get the buy-in and agree kind of the importance and how we can make sure people continue to contribute. So what was next, right? This is a bit hypothetical because I set this in motion and then left, but let's see what in theory was next. So the first thing I just mentioned was growth, basically re-engaging with the boring business stuff to kind of continue to get people to contribute. We didn't want it to run forever. Again, most of the value was captured really in those first 100 tables. But there's other stuff that could kind of continue to be added and different asset types and stuff. So how do we kind of grow this, both in terms of contribution, but also in terms of people using it to get information out of? And then the other thing was kind of a V2 of testing. So we only really had one good Python developer in the team who was able to actually write those tests, and they were quite manual. So there was some stuff that was quite repetitive that we could have probably pulled some functions out of. But if we were going to do that, we kind of were going to take this as a chance to really overhaul the entire thing, right? Most of the tests were this header block should have some kind of content, right? It might be plain text, it might be a link, it might be a table, it might be a list, it might be some combination of them. And it should have these headers at this header level. So in theory, we could actually write that in like a JSON file that would describe each kind of test we would want to run, and it would just be some type of test. So, plain text following this regex or whatever. And then we would have a Python script that would actually write the Python file that defines those tests, which would then run on the markdown document that is the note. So it's a couple of extra steps, but what it meant was once it was done, people could just basically add to the JSON file and it would write the tests for them. So they didn't have to know Python, they just had to basically look at the JSON file, see how it looked for the other stuff and copy it in. If you wanted to add new test types, then yes, you would have to write more Python. But as it stands at the moment, kind of that V1 of testing, if you wanted to add a new asset type or a new header or that, you had to write the Python test explicitly yourself. So this was kind of moving everything a little more, hopefully upstream was the idea. So just to recap, we started with the complete lie that I told you I was going to document 10,000 tables when actually we documented kind of a little over 100. But, Mr. Pareto, big fan of him, just do bare minimum and get maximum results out of it. We had all of these issues where we kind of were losing a lot of knowledge over time. We didn't really have a lot of influence and funding and power. We went with Dendron, obvious choice, and then built this solution that focused really heavily on the structure and the hierarchy agreement up front, generated a lot of our notes automatically, built very, very hacky PyTest testing, because in hindsight, we should have taken the time and just learned to build a markdown linter and just custom done that. But we didn't know how to do that, and we knew how to do PyTest, so it made more sense at the time. And then it worked, right? It pretty much delivered what we needed it to, but there were some things we could do to hopefully help kind of it continue to grow going forward. And that's it. Done speaking, so if there's any questions.
Yeah, first, Ryan, thanks for the fantastic talk. I know I've heard bits and pieces of this story, but first time seeing it end to end. And that is quite the hero's journey you have mapped out there.
It was it was a fun. Like I said, I had done I tried to do something similar before, and basically just hit dead end after dead end because it was just basically like, hey, can you write a load of SQL files and then commit them, but with no benefit to you. Just please commit them for us. So there was a lot of learning from that, but a lot of the issues we have with that were made basically mute in this way because of the tool we were using.
Yeah. So it looks like Jeep has a question. So I can read it, or Jeep, if you feel like unmuting, you can also say it.
Okay, that's fine. I can ask it. Yeah, I've been involved in a lot of stopgap solutions that just wind up being the permanent solution. So do you have thoughts or ideas on how you fight the entropy with this solution?
Yeah. I mean, the reason we needed this solution in the first place, one of those databases was meant to be a sandbox environment and then became critical for day-to-day reporting, so I'm more than familiar with it. I think it was kind of twofold. So one of the things, and actually I didn't specifically call it out, was that we weren't putting people's names against things, and we were also asking people to only put information down that was timeless, almost like, right? So don't say that, oh, in a month's time this is going to change to this and do that, right? We weren't asking for kind of that sort of context. We were really asking for, what is the description of this table? What does this column do? And most of those tables are reasonably stable in time. So in terms of, even if it did become a never replaced solution, the information there should have still been accurate. We had a method to be able to add more things in as time went, right? The table structures weren't really going to change, which is one of the big things that this was built for. So we kind of built it a little tongue-in-cheek with the knowledge that, look, someone might say, oh, we're going to have a metadata solution in 6 months. We're not, right? So what are we actually going to do instead? Well, we'll build this in such a way that people aren't putting their name against it, so they don't feel like they're the owner of it for the next 2 years, because then you don't get people contributing. And we also were only asking for timeless information. The other thing, and potentially why this maybe I was more confident in this, is that the company was spending a lot to go through a cloud migration journey in the next year or two. I'm one of those data management people I was kind of speaking about on the slide that was saying, why are you building this? We're going to have this tool, was in the same team as me as well. So I worked with them and kind of knew that the tool was being brought in and existed. So more so than probably anything, I did have confidence that at some point at least the table part would be replaced. But at the same time, all of the reporting stuff that got kind of added in, all of the measure definitions that got added in, and also just the idea that we could kind of keep adding assets to this, actually kind of convinced me that not all of this needs to be scrapped going forward. So some of it might be kept around where it might not migrate to this metadata solution, or they might add kind of a new asset type or something in there, because you've got the whole team kind of, the wider team knows how to contribute to it, knows how to get information out of it. So again, we kind of built it in that extendable way where, yeah, you're right. Probably some of it is not going to go away because it's the only place it's recorded. But that's why almost we wanted to get it right, and why we went through that quite long journey, right? Quite a strict list of requirements, really locking down on those templates, because we knew we could have just been like, we don't need to test the stuff. Just get a template and then hope people follow it. Or we don't really need to lock down our hierarchies at the front. We can change stuff as we go. It's only be around for a while. But we kind of knew that it probably will be around for a while, and we do want to be able to scrape information out of it, and we don't really trust people. So we kind of almost built it properly, as where maybe beforehand we would have gone, it's a stopgap solution, let's not worry about it. So basically answered your question by saying, now we know it's going to stick around. We just built it, hopefully, right? But yeah, hopefully that answers your question somewhat.
Yeah, I think I've not seen like a prototype solution. Well, very rarely have I seen a prototype that has not ended up, if successful, make itself into production. One question I had was for, like, after you guys had all the tables documented, how was it consumed? Like, what were the use cases? Did people, like, have VS Code open and then, like, navigate to your engine? Did you publish this internally? But what was the main interface?
So we published internally, and that was actually part of the like our requirement list was that kind of easy to get information out of, also actually just meant it wasn't just in VS Code, for example. So most people, even after having been taken through VS Code and how to use Dendron, would consume it via we just published it internally on a GitLab Pages site. And that, again, was a great benefit for us because we didn't have to worry about building all this front-end stuff and having all of that, right? It was there. People could then search for things. Again, the hierarchy made it nice and easy. I'm looking for this table in this schema. I want to know about it. Great, it's there. And part of the reason for having those kind of templated notes on those Git branches was so we only brought into the main branch, which was the published site, the notes that had been actually contributed to. But if they needed to, they could always go and find those other notes on the other branches, but they wouldn't be able to see them in the published site. So I think we had a few kind of the people who would use VS Code more comfortably and be confident in that would consume it via VS Code and Dendron, but most people would consume it via that front end, particularly because the people who are kind of trying to consume it are not our tech experts as well. It's kind of someone's asked them to do something, say, it involves this table. Okay, what does that go and look and do that, and then kind of learn. And it's also just a bit easier to consume when you've got like a 150 row table where one row is the column name for everything. It's a bit easier to see that in a published site than it is in Markdown. I love Markdown, but the tables are a nightmare. So yeah, mostly published, but a few of the people who would be confident in VS Code would then go. They tended to prefer that because it's easier to find stuff using the search in VS Code, but our main selling point actually was the published front end.
Got it. And in terms of, because I'm not a data engineer and have only worked with some, but what were the main use cases for looking up tables? Like, was it like when they needed to look up information or like modify the tables or?
I think it's probably the term now is actually analytics engineer for what we were doing. The term didn't really exist when we made the team a few years ago, and as with all data stuff, there's just tons of new words. So the team basically would be taking data in the database and writing scripts or normally procedures to produce transformed tables on top of that, or combined tables or stuff, which could then be used onwards for reporting or kind of insight purposes. So normally we would get a request in that's like, hey, I need a table that tells us how many tasks every employee did per week for the last 2 years, and it should have a column for the country they live in and the color of hat they wear and all that kind of stuff, right? Your normal BI question that everyone loves and adds no value. So that would kind of come in, and for people who've been there for ages, you'd know, okay, I know the hat table. Is it called employee hat? No, of course it's not. But they'd know where that kind of information is. They'd worked with it enough. And then within that table, they'd also know what columns mean what, right? So they've worked with it, they've asked the questions, they've made the mistakes. Because we had so many new people coming in, they just didn't have that. They might have the domain knowledge of kind of, I understand what tasks are and a hat is, but where to find that data and what our column names meant was kind of potentially unfamiliar. So instead of having to spend loads of time asking the senior devs and kind of putting on teams, like, hey, where's the hat table? They could go in and kind of search and find that information, or probably what had happened is someone had gone, hey, here's this task, you'll need to use this table, this table, this table, go and work it out, basically. And then they would go on here, and that would have the information, at least of the columns and the context of the table, right? Is this table still updated? If someone wants this data at 9 a.m. every day, well, is the data you're using going to be available at 9 a.m. every day? And that would be something that was listed there as well. So, it was kind of sort of, in theory, it was meant to be table discovery, which there definitely was some of, because you could kind of search for column names and that, but a lot of it was more around, people keep talking about this table, I need to use it, what's the information in it, that kind of stuff.
Got it. In terms of the having like an agreed upon template and schema, did you find any resistance in terms of agreeing to a single format?
As in within the people making the template or the people using it?
In either direction, because I find like that's one of the hard part, especially in big organizations, is that every team tends to have their own like slightly different variant, and so did you hit any obstacles in either making or like the usage of the standards that you put in place?
Not too much. We kind of were lucky that as we were selling this to people and being like, yes, why should you have people were like, yes, we need this, right? It's so annoying to not have any of this written anywhere. So we actually, and because we kind of sold the benefit of the structure, and we showed them the front end up front and went, look, this is what the output will look like. Most people were quite comfortable providing that sort of information, and kind of understood the bits that this auto-population of notes was really important in this. So if we'd just given someone the blank template and went, go and fill this in, they'd have said, absolutely not. It's way too long. There's too much in here. Because we'd managed to auto-populate a lot of the stuff, we were just asking them for kind of their like contextual information and knowledge. And the stuff we were asking for was like, hey, can you describe the column, right? Can you give us a 150-character summary of the table? It's stuff that made sense to anyone who used it. And yeah, because we didn't have anything, it wasn't like we were fighting against people being like, oh, you should use this template or this one, right? It was kind of, well, now we can make whatever we want. We did, once we'd kind of mostly settled on those templates, we did double check with kind of the people who would be contributing to them and say, look, is there anything you think that's missing here in terms of like headers or structure or stuff? And when we started to add those other assets, so I mentioned like reports that were based in Click, the kind of BI tool, we didn't build them, right? We weren't the experts on Click reporting, so we worked with the team that builds them and said, right, what should this structure be? You know, we would kind of keep some of the stuff, right? Here's the note status, general information stays the same for everything, but what defines a report, right? And got them thinking in a Dendron way as well. So said, well, actually, stuff like what measures are listed in here should be in the report note, because you can have multiple measures per report, and a measure can be used by multiple reports, but you should define your measure in a different asset type. But you don't want to, in your measure, list every report it's used in, because now when you create a report, you've got to go and do your report and your asset, and your measure. So it was probably the trickiest part, was getting people to think in that both hierarchical and sort of link-based way, to say, well, actually, what is your hierarchy structure of a report, right? How is stuff organized? But then also, well, no, you don't want to list that in here. That should be its own asset type, or you should do that in that asset type. Which direction should the links kind of go? Because people weren't used to potentially having that backlink information, which was, again, really, really useful, because it meant if you define a measure, well, that measure is defined. You can now use it in, list it in every report that uses it, and you don't have to then go to the measures information and list it all out again. So probably not so much a challenge or a difficulty against it, because people weren't fighting it, but getting them to think in like a backlink and link and this hierarchy was probably the tricky part. But once they saw the benefit, they were really on board.
Got it. And then I'll have a follow-up. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to chime in or just put it in the chat. But I'm just endlessly fascinated with this. Were you able to have any sort of concrete metrics in terms of how impactful this was? And I know you alluded to this, it's like it was hard to get executive buy-in for this. And this is certainly like the hard part about productivity like tools is, were you able to have some sort of sense of impact? Like before and after, like did it save X amount of time? Did it like either quantitative or like anecdotal?
Yeah, so I probably can't give one, partly because most of the merge requests went in like just as I was leaving, so I'd left the company, so it was difficult to kind of say the true impact on kind of the output. But I think what I can say is, and particularly compared to the last time I tried to do this, was that everyone who engaged, so all of the people who came to the hackathons and contributed to it, everyone we spoke to about it and shared it with, was really, really positive about it and really, really keen to get involved, and keen more so to see the output than to contribute to it. But anyway, so yeah, it's hard for me to kind of say, oh, this was much better for all of this and that kind of stuff. But a lot of those kind of new starters that I spoke about, even when we had a few in there, like, oh, this already makes a difference, or people who'd been there, like I say, 25 years, were like, oh, finally there's something that actually is better than an Excel spreadsheet and we can kind of contribute to it. So kind of the range of people we were working with and got engaged with it all seemed really positive about it, and were keen that not only did we need something, which everyone could agree on anyway, but also that this was a good solution for it and in theory would make their lives easier. So it's hard to kind of pinpoint specifically on the output of it. But I also know, even though it's not necessarily being, I don't know how much is still being contributed to, I still know some people that still go there for that information now. So it's not kind of been launched and then it's dead. At least people are still consuming from what's there, which has been really, really useful. So yeah, I can't quite be like, oh yeah, no, we cut questions by 50% or whatever, but I can say everyone who got involved both recognized that something was needed and that this was a good solution to the problem.
Mm-hmm. I see Jeep is typing. Do you want to feel free to also just like ask it? Okay. Jeep is saying thank you. Then I'll just have one more question before I let you go. And this is, so it sounds like this was a big endeavor. You've had like success, you had merges, you had the like 20% of the impactful tables documented. If you were thinking of doing something like this again, knowing what you do now, would you do anything differently about trying to set up this process?
I think if it was the same sort of environment and kind of situation that it was kind of spawned from, I think probably it's the boring business stuff, right? But I think probably agreeing more up front, or attempting to agree more up front, like how this becomes part of people's responsibilities or expectations. So a team's success is measured not just by the number of reports they deliver or the number of procedures they write, but also the amount they're contributing to this documentation. I think would be one of the things to try and kind of get set up front. I definitely think the testing and scraping we learned a lot of as we went through. I think getting that kind of, just being able to basically dump the notes in with the front matter and it will work would have saved us some time. I think the testing, it's easy to pick testing because we didn't really know what we were doing and there was a lot of hacking around, and we now know that there's this better approach where rather than the writing of the tests themselves being the bottleneck, we can kind of bring that upstream in this more dynamic kind of programming way. So it's kind of the boring tech stuff. I think also we probably, even though we gave ourselves what we thought was a lot of time, we were still tweaking the templates just slightly as we were going kind of more towards the deadline, and the same with kind of the generation of the notes. And when you're looking at a template, you go, oh, changing this from optional to mandatory, you just change some text in a markdown, or removing an S in this header, right? It's not going to make a big difference. But actually, if you've already written the Python script to run the tests on that, because the way we'd written it, that is quite annoying and fiddly to make sure it works and everything works together. And kind of on our first hackathon, that was the one we accidentally had pushed to main on, so everyone cloned all of our changes, so we were dealing with that issue. The tests just actually didn't work, to be honest, on the first one. We had to then go through and rebase everyone's branches to the right test. So again, kind of giving ourselves more time than we thought is probably the big thing. But no, I think but what we needed, the approach we took, I think it was just making, and it's the same thing I've learned from both times I've attempted this, it's getting in, how do you make it so that this contributing to this or doing this becomes part of a team's success or their kind of day-to-day work, rather than just this, okay, you've told us to do it, we'll do it, but now there's something more important to do. I don't know that I know the answer to that, because it's always going to be difficult to sell people on why there's always something that's more urgent and more important than writing documentation, but then everyone loves good documentation. So I don't know the answer, but that's probably the thing. If I could snap my fingers and had something change, that probably would have removed the asterisks on the yes, put it that way.
Got it. All right, well, that brings us an end to this greenhouse. Ryan, thank you for the fantastic presentation. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah. And we'll have a copy of the recording. And Ryan, if you have the slides available or if there's any reference material that you want us to include, we'll also add that to the notes.
Share them across.
All right. Well, meanwhile, everyone, thanks for watching and have a wonderful weekend. Bye.